It was around 10:30 p.m. on the 21st of April 1977. 17-year-old Bill Bartlett was driving his dad's Volkswagen down the long stretch of Farm Street in Dover, Massachusetts. Also in the car were two of his friends, Andy Brody and Mike Mazzoka. As they approached the bend leading towards Smith Street, Bill saw what he thought was a cat or a dog climbing on top of a pile of loose stones at the side of the road. But as they got closer, the creature lifted its head and stared directly at the car, and Bill realised that this was no animal that he'd ever seen before. At the sight of this thing, Bill Bartlett hit the accelerator and he sped past it as fast as he could. As he did so, he shouted, "Did you see that?" But his friends had seen nothing. Mike had been looking out of the passenger side window at the time. Andy was in the back seat and he'd been talking to Mike. Neither of them had been watching the road ahead. Bill's friends could see that he was extremely rattled by whatever he'd seen. Once they got some distance up the road, he pulled the car over and he described it to them. The thing he'd seen had been small. He estimated it to be about 3 or 4 feet tall. It had a stretched, thin body covered in a dirty, peach-coloured flesh that had the texture of wet sandpaper. It had extremely long fingers and toes that grasped onto the rocks as it climbed them. The creature appeared to wobble unsteadily over the rocks as if its footing was unsure. The head was far too big for the body, almost impossibly so considering how thin its neck was. It had no visible mouth, ears or nose, but it had large, round, marble-like eyes that reflected orange in the car's headlights. Bill's friends were obviously intrigued by this. They didn't exactly believe Bill, but they could tell that he was genuinely terrified by whatever he'd witnessed. Excited at the prospect of seeing this melon-headed creature for themselves, they begged him to go back. At first Bill refused. He had no desire to see whatever that thing was ever again, but they were pretty persistent, so eventually he turned the car around and they drove back to the Farm Street bend where he'd had his sighting. And you can imagine what a bunch of teenage boys were like in this situation. As they got close to the spot, Mike and Andy started hanging out of the car, shouting things like, "Come on, creature, we want to see you." Of course, the creature was nowhere to be seen, but Bill was still terrified, and he begged them to roll up their windows. After driving up and down a few times, they must have decided that the creature wasn't going to make an appearance, and so they left the area again. Bill dropped off his friends and then returned home. When he arrived, his father immediately noticed that something had really shaken him. His father would later say that when Bill described the creature he'd encountered, he could tell that the fear was real, and he knew that Bill wasn't the sort of person who would invent silly stories. Bill Bartlett was a good student and a talented artist. He was a member of the Copley Art Society, so the next thing he did was to draw a picture of what he had seen. This is the drawing that Bill made that night. Next to it he wrote, "I, Bill Bartlett, swear on a stack of Bibles that I saw this creature." At around 12:30 that very same night, 15-year-old John Baxter was walking home from his girlfriend's house along Miller Hill Road. About halfway up the road, he saw ahead of him a short figure approaching. It was pretty dark at the time, so he could only see the outline of this thing, but from its short stature, he thought that it might be a kid who lived on a street called M.G. Bouchard. So John calls out, "MG, is that you?" But the figure didn't respond, so John continues to walk towards it, and the figure walks towards him. They get to within about 15 feet of each other when the figure suddenly stops. John's getting a bit weirded out at this point, so he shouts out, "Who is that?" He takes a step towards it, and suddenly the figure darts off the road. It runs down the embankment of a drainage gully and up the other side. John climbs down the gully after it, but he soon comes to a quick stop once he gets a better look at it. From this position, the figure is slightly higher than he is, and he can now see the outline of it against the sky behind it. It appears to be a very thin, short, humanoid creature with an extremely bulbous head. The creature was standing upright on a rock and holding onto a tree for support. John can see that it has unnaturally long fingers and toes. It's still too dark to see the face clearly, but he can make out two large eyes, and they appear to be staring directly at him. The two of them stand there staring at each other for a while, but then John gets this really uneasy feeling, as if the creature is getting ready to pounce or something. He turns tail, scrambles back up onto Miller Hill Road, and then hurries along it for another mile or so before catching a lift home. Now, apparently John Baxter hadn't heard about Bill Bartlett's encounter at this point, but when he got home, he also drew a picture of what he had seen. I know this sounds weird. Two people see the creature in a space of about 2 hours, and both of them decide to draw a picture of it as soon as they get home. I'll come back to this later on, but for now let's just take everything as read and let's have a look at John Baxter's drawings. There's two drawings that I could find attributed to Baxter. One of them he was photographed holding once the story got out. The other I could only find this god-awfully low-resolution version of, but you can still make out what it is, and as you can see, the creature he drew bears an uncanny resemblance to the thing that Bill Bartlett sketched. The following night, at around midnight, 18-year-old Will Taintor was driving along Springdale Avenue. In the passenger seat was 15-year-old Abby Brabham. As they were passing a part of the road that crosses a small stream, Abby saw something on the other side of the road, looking directly at the car. Abby was pretty alarmed by whatever this was, so she told Will to speed up so that they could pass it quickly. Will hadn't spotted the thing yet, and by the time that Abby mentioned it, he only managed to get a very brief glimpse of something crouched by the road before it passed out of sight. It was too quick for him to make out any details, but he got the impression that whatever it was hairless and tan-coloured, and it had a very large head. His brief glimpse brought to mind something that his friend had told him about earlier that day. You see, Will Taintor was close friends with our first witness, Bill Bartlett, and by that point Bill had told him about this strange sighting he'd had the night before. Will didn't get a good enough look to say if he'd seen the same thing as Bill, but Abby had got a much better view of the thing, so when they arrived home he asked her to describe it as best she could. The creature that she'd seen had been hairless and looked to be tan or beige in colour. It had been crouched on all fours on the side of the road, with its large, oblong-shaped head raised to look at the car. She saw no mouth, ears or nose, but she did notice that its eyes glowed green in the car's headlights. As Will already knew about Bill Bartlett's encounter, he decided to test Abby, so he started asking her leading questions about the thing, adding details that he knew weren't true to see if she would slip up. Abby remained firm in what she had seen. Apart from the colour of the eyes, almost every detail she described was exactly the same as Bill's sighting. He then asked Abby to draw a picture of the creature, and this is what she drew. It's a lot more rudimentary than the drawings by John and Bill, and there are differences. The body and the limbs look a lot different. This could be down to the position it was in when she saw it, or perhaps she just couldn't draw it very accurately, or she might have seen a completely different creature altogether. But the head is very similar to the first two sightings, almost too similar to be a coincidence. All three of these creature sightings occurred over a 25-hour period on a Thursday and Friday night during spring break. They were due to go back to school the following Monday. This has led some people to wonder whether the whole thing was just a spring break prank, a bunch of teens deciding to spend their last few days of freedom inventing a monster to scare their friends. All of the witnesses went to the same school and they were acquaintances. As I said earlier, Bill Bartlett and Will Tainter were friends. Bill Bartlett and John Baxter were also sometimes seen together, although they claim they weren't close friends but moved loosely within the same group of high schoolers. The thing is, none of them seemed to actively try and spread the word about the sightings. Obviously, over the following days, there were some murmurings between people about this supposed creature, but there wasn't some concerted effort to turn it into a big story or a local legend. In fact, by most accounts, the teens later seemed uncomfortable with the attention. Bill Bartlett in particular was reluctant to talk about it, only giving details when pressed by his friends. Also, if it was a hoax, wouldn't Will Tainter's sighting be more elaborate? He claims he only got a fleeting glimpse of the thing, so much so that he wasn't even sure if he had actually seen the creature or not. It was only Abby Brabham in the passenger seat that got a decent look at it, and she claims that she knew nothing about the other sightings at the time. It also goes some way to explain why she drew a picture of the creature too. Will Tainter would have known about Bill Bartlett's sketch, and he would have wanted to see if her drawing matched his. Of all the sightings, I think the second one, John Baxter's encounter, is a little suspect. Baxter was described as a bit of a sci-fi fan, and he wrote science fiction stories in his spare time. He claims that he saw the creature on the exact same night as Bill Bartlett. Then he went home and drew a picture of it, just like Bill Bartlett did, and his picture is almost exactly the same as Bill's. You could say the images look alike just because they saw the same thing, but I can't help but think that even if two people did see the same unknown creature in the dark, and they were later asked to draw it, the drawings would show significant differences. People interpret and remember details differently, especially in a high-stress situation like encountering a naked, faceless goblin in the middle of the night. Eyewitnesses to the same event rarely produce near-identical recollections of the event, but these drawings show almost exactly the same pose and outline. It could be that John Baxter saw Bill's picture at some point and then decided to draw a copy of it. And that's not to say that he didn't experience something strange that night. Maybe he did, and he just made the drawing because he thought no one would believe him. It's hard to say for sure, but it does feel slightly off to me. Some investigators at the time who questioned the witnesses also said that John Baxter seemed to be the most cagey and evasive when talking about his sighting, which led a few of them to question his account more than others. But yeah, I'm not saying John Baxter's sighting never happened. I'm just saying there's questions. You can make your own mind up there. So, following the sightings, there were only a handful of teenagers who knew about this supposed creature, and that didn't change until the following Monday, when spring break finished and the kids went back to school. A science teacher named Robert Linton overheard Bill Bartlett talking to another student about the creature. Linton was intrigued, and he asked Bill to describe his encounter in more detail. Bill did so, and he drew another picture of what he had seen. The science teacher would later say, "Bill seemed extremely sincere, and I had to believe him." This part of the tale also seems to lend credence to the idea that it wasn't a deliberate prank, at least not on Bill's behalf. He didn't try to spread the word of his sighting. It was seemingly by chance that someone outside of his friend group just happened to hear him talking about it. And it looks like from here on, the rumours really began to spread, most likely among the teachers and the other students at first, but then out into the wider Dover community. And then there was another chance encounter. A paranormal researcher and cryptozoologist named Lauren Coleman, who at the time was living in the nearby town of Needham, happened to be visiting the Dover country store. One of the clerks in there recognised him and then told him that some kids had apparently seen a strange creature. The clerk told him that one of the kids had drawn the thing and then promised to get him pictures. So Lauren Coleman returned to the store 2 days later, and the clerk handed him 2 of Bill Bartlett's sketches. The following day, Coleman tracks down Bill Bartlett and interviews him and finds him to be a credible witness. Bill puts him in touch with the other witnesses. After talking to all the witnesses and finding them to be pretty genuine, Lauren Coleman decides to contact Walter Webb, Joseph Nyman and Ed Fogg. These were 3 researchers from different UFO investigation teams. He wanted them to join him in examining the case. There weren't any UFO sightings associated with the encounters, but the creature's resemblance to other reported alien beings drew their attention. The arrival of these investigators created even more buzz around the town of Dover. It was Lauren Coleman himself who coined the phrase Dover Demon. Not because there was any evidence of it being demonic in nature, but, it just rolls off the tongue quite well, so the name stuck. Eventually, the Dover Police Department got involved. Lauren Coleman had sent them one of Bill Bartlett's sketches in case any other witnesses came forward. The Dover Police Chief, Carl Sheridan, knew Bill Bartlett personally. He described Bill as an outstanding artist and a reliable witness. Another officer was quoted in the South Middlesex News as saying, "At first I was going to ask one of the witnesses to give me whatever it was he was smoking, but I know all 4 and I know that to all of us they're very reputable people." It seems strange that the police would put their reputations on the line over what on the surface could look like a silly monster story unless they genuinely believed the witnesses weren't playing a prank. I'm not saying they believed that there was an alien or a demon running around Dover, but they certainly believed that the kids had seen something. The officers were dispatched to the sites of the alleged sightings, but of course they found nothing. And it was the police who eventually broke the story to the press. A local radio station called the Dover Police Department looking for interesting stories, and they were informed about the Dover Demon case. From there, the story spread to local newspapers and soon gained national attention. The witnesses enjoyed a bit of time in the limelight after that. Bill Bartlett's drawings were shown in newspapers and on TV shows across the country. A watercolour painting by Bill was even hung up in the Dover Police Department. But it doesn't look like this attention was actively sought out by the witnesses. They only agreed to interviews after constant hounding from various media outlets. Years later, Bartlett would say, "It was my 15 minutes of fame without wanting it. It was a little embarrassing. It still is." What I find interesting is that there hasn't been any other sightings of the Dover Demon since then. You'd think that once the media circus started, someone else would try to jump in on the bandwagon and claim their own sighting, or if it had been a hoax, someone would have come forward to admit it by now, but there's been nothing. There is, however, a possible earlier sighting of the creature. In a 2006 article, a local man named Mark Sennett claims that in the early 1970s there was talk among the Dover Sherborne high schoolers of strange things seen in the woods. Unfortunately, the article doesn't elaborate on what these strange things might have been, but Sennett may have seen the creature himself. In 1972, he and a group of friends were in his car at Channing Pond on Springdale Avenue. As it says, "I don't know if we really saw something. We thought we did. We saw a small figure deep in the woods, moving at the edge of the pond. We could see it moving in the headlights. We didn't know. It could have been an animal." Sennett also says that they told the police about it and the police investigated, but nothing came of it. Sadly, the article doesn't go into any more detail about what he saw. It's a very vague description, but I guess because it is so vague, it's not the sort of thing that someone would make up if they were just trying to cash in on the story. It's also interesting that he had his sighting at Channing Pond on Springdale Avenue. Springdale Avenue was the site of the third encounter reported by Will Taintor and Abby Brabham. So what could the Dover demon have been? The idea that the whole thing was a hoax can't be discounted entirely. Apart from the eyewitness accounts, no other evidence of the Dover demon has ever been found. And if the witnesses didn't invent the story, there's always the possibility that someone was playing a prank on them. Maybe someone was stalking around the woods of Dover late at night and in the early hours of the morning, waiting for a chance encounter to scare some kids. But it would be pretty difficult to pull off convincingly. From the description of the creature, it would have to be a very small child or some kind of elaborate puppet. How you could successfully fool 4 people and remain undetected, it's not exactly outside the realms of possibility, but it does seem unlikely. There's also the idea that it could have been a misidentified animal. Martin Kottmeyer wrote an extensive article on how the Dover demon was actually a baby moose. A baby moose seen in low light from a certain angle, if it had its ears held back, could give the appearance of a large-headed humanoid creature. Some have suggested that it could have been a fox or a raccoon, or even an escaped monkey. This could fit the bill, I suppose, especially if the animal had contracted a disease that caused it to lose its fur. Hairless animals have often been misidentified as something otherworldly. Personally, I think these theories would hold more weight if only one person had seen the creature. I could see how someone might get a glimpse of some animal in the dark and then think that they'd seen something else. But multiple people saw this thing. Even if we just take the 2 clearest sightings, Bill Bartlett's and Abby Brabham's, they both saw a very similar, bold, naked creature with a large head and no facial features except for the glowing eyes. It's hard to see how any animal, no matter how diseased or deformed, might fit the bill. And that doesn't mean that it's definitely something paranormal. I just think there's some holes in the more conventional explanations. Maybe the Dover demon was some kind of unknown animal or a rare genetic mutation of something more mundane. But the supernatural explanations are worth looking at too. So, as I said earlier, ufologists were very interested in this case. Obviously that's because the creature had a close resemblance to other reports of encounters with supposed alien creatures. The large, bold head, the big eyes, the thin body and the short stature. It's pretty much your classic grey alien, give or take a few details. By the late 1970s, this grey alien archetype was already well established within the UFO circles. Since the early 1960s, especially after the Barney and Betty Hill abduction case, ufologists had been discussing small, pale, large-headed humanoids with oversized eyes as the most common type of creature reported in alien encounters. The creature also bore a resemblance to the ones reported in the 1955 Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter. This is when a group of adults and children claimed that their farmhouse was besieged by a number of small humanoid entities. These creatures were described as being about 2 to 4 feet in height, with thin bodies, large heads, round glowing orange eyes, and long talon-like fingers. Although these creatures were noted as having big pointy ears, unlike the Dover demon. Usually these experiences are accompanied by strange lights and UFO sightings. There were no reported UFO sightings associated with the Dover demon case, but still the ufologists were interested. Others have suggested that the Dover demon might be some sort of cryptid, something akin to the chupacabra. It's worth noting that every sighting of the Dover demon was very close to a stream or pond. If you draw all the encounters on a map, you'll see that this area is dotted with many streams, creeks and ponds. There are numerous folklore tales about strange entities that lurk near to bodies of water, usually causing mischief to anyone who strays too close. For example, the Grindilo from English folklore, described as human-like beings with extended arms and long fingers, they would apparently drag children into the water if they got too close to the edge. American folklore has the water babies, said to inhabit rivers and ponds. Water babies take the form of infant human babies. These creatures can mimic the sounds of human babies, and they lure innocent bystanders into the water and then they feed on them. Mexican folklore has the Chaniquis. Chiniqui are short in stature and they usually appear naked. They live in forests, rivers or caves and are connected to the earth and water. They may not always be visible to adults, but children can generally see them. In Canada, the Cree people talk of the Managishi, small riverbank dwelling spirits. In some traditions, they can only be seen by children and medicine people. They are described as pygmy, human-like entities that resemble little men with long, thin legs and arms. They are said to have 12 fingers, 6 on each hand. Their round, hairless heads with large eyes and no nose are apparently quite big in comparison to their bodies. And as you can see from this page, I'm not the first person to compare the Managishi legend to the Dover demon. But what I'm trying to say is, stories about strange water-dwelling creatures appear all over the world, and a lot of them have very similar descriptions to the Dover demon. It's also interesting that a lot of these stories either mention them targeting children, mimicking children, or that only children can see them. Notice that everyone who saw the Dover demon was of high school age. But anyway, I'm not trying to convince you on one theory or another here. It's just one of those strange stories that doesn't have a satisfactory answer. Bill Bartlett went on to be a successful artist later in life, and he's always maintained that he did actually see the creature exactly as he drew it. In an interview he said, "What I saw, it did happen. I don't know what it is, but I still saw it. It wasn't a hoax. It was 10 seconds whilst driving a car and I still remember it. To this day, it's still perplexing. Whatever it was strange looking." So, thanks for watching the video. I hope you found it interesting. Some people have been asking about the drawings I do for these videos, if they're AI or something. They're just little sketches I do on my phone. I don't really have a problem with AI. I've tried it before in videos, I just don't really like the look of it. It's got a bit of an uncanny valley feel to it. Even though the sketches are a bit rough, I much prefer them because they look like a real person's made them. I make them quite quickly. I use a lot of reference images for them, and yeah, they're pretty easy to make, and I think they do a good job illustrating the stories, especially when I'm covering these sort of weird cryptid cases. Plus, I really enjoy drawing, so I take pretty much any opportunity to do it. So yeah, people were asking, so there you go. Huge thanks to everybody who's supporting my stuff. Thank you to all my patrons, it's much appreciated. Apologies that this video took a bit longer to come out than usual. I've been a bit sick the last week or so. But anyway, I'll see you on the next one. Until next time, goodbye.